On the 6th of July, 1988, 167 men died aboard Piper Alpha. Their names are preserved on memorials far from the platform's former position in the North Sea, but the scale of the loss cannot be understood through a number alone. Each name represented a family waiting for news, a workplace emptied overnight, and a life that did not return from an ordinary offshore shift. Piper Alpha became the deadliest offshore oil disaster in history, yet it did not begin with one vast, unavoidable catastrophe. It began inside a working production platform, among routine operations, maintenance procedures and decisions made within a complex industrial system. To understand why the emergency grew so rapidly, it is necessary to understand the world in which the platform operated. By the late 20th century, the North Sea had become one of Europe's most important offshore oil and gas regions. Platforms stood miles from land, exposed to severe weather, and connected to distant fields and terminals through pipelines beneath the sea. These installations were more than drilling structures. They were compact industrial complexes where hydrocarbons were received, processed, and exported, while crews lived and worked above the water. Equipment carrying flammable material operated close to control rooms, power systems, and accommodation areas. Piper Alpha was part of that offshore network. Operated by Occidental, it was built to produce oil from the Piper field. Over time, its role changed and its processing systems became more complicated. By July 1988, the platform was handling not only its own production, but flows linked to a much wider North Sea infrastructure. That connection made Piper Alpha valuable. It would also become central to the disaster. When fire took hold, the danger would not come only from the fuel already aboard the platform. It would also come through the pipelines that tied Piper Alpha to the surrounding oil and gas network. An offshore platform had to function as a factory, power station, accommodation block, and transport hub, all within a confined structure surrounded by open sea. On Piper Alpha, crude oil and gas passed through processing equipment under high pressure. Pumps, compressors, separators, and pipelines operated close to control systems, and the areas where crews worked, ate, and slept. The platform had originally been designed mainly for oil production. Later modifications allowed it to process gas as well. These changes increased the amount of equipment aboard and altered the way hazardous material moved through the installation. Space was limited. New systems had to be fitted around an existing design, creating an increasingly complex arrangement in which production, utilities, and occupied areas remained closely connected. By 1988, Piper Alpha was one of the most productive platforms in the North Sea. Its output formed part of a larger network operated under constant pressure to maintain production. Oil and gas did not simply leave Piper Alpha through one isolated route. The platform received hydrocarbons from other fields and transferred processed material through pipelines leading towards shore. This meant a shutdown could affect more than one installation. Decisions made on neighboring platforms could influence the conditions aboard Piper Alpha, while failures on Piper Alpha could disrupt the wider network. None of this made disaster inevitable. Offshore systems were designed with permits, alarms, shutdown procedures, and emergency equipment, intended to prevent a single fault from becoming catastrophic. But those protections depended on accurate information, clear communication, and the ability to isolate dangerous equipment quickly. On the night of the disaster, several of those safeguards would fail at almost the same time. Piper Alpha did not stand alone in the North Sea. It formed part of an interconnected network of offshore installations linked by high-pressure pipelines carrying oil and natural gas between production fields and terminals onshore. Under normal conditions, these connections improved efficiency. Platforms could receive production from neighboring fields, process it, and send it onward through export pipelines. But they also meant that enormous quantities of pressurized hydrocarbons existed beyond the platform itself. If a serious fire developed, shutting down Piper Alpha alone would not immediately remove that danger. Unless the incoming pipelines were isolated, gas already flowing through the network could continue feeding the flames. Those pipelines contained vast amounts of energy. Once compromised, they could transform a major industrial fire into something far beyond the capacity of onboard firefighting systems. Modern offshore platforms are often shown as symbols of advanced engineering, but many of the safety principles now taken for granted were strengthened only after Piper Alpha. Today, operators place far greater emphasis on hazard assessments, fire protection, emergency shutdown systems, blast-resistant design, and formal safety management. Physical layouts are carefully reviewed to reduce the consequences of explosions or major fires, while emergency planning is continuously tested. Even so, offshore production remains an inherently hazardous industry. Highly flammable materials are processed under extreme pressure in isolated locations, where outside assistance may still take considerable time to arrive. In July 1988, many of these later improvements did not yet exist. Piper Alpha relied on procedures, permits, and communication between workers to keep hazardous equipment under control. On the evening of the 6th of July, a routine maintenance task would expose how fragile those layers of protection could become when critical information failed to reach the people who needed it most. Wednesday, the 6th of July, 1988, began like countless other days aboard Piper Alpha. More than 200 men were working 12-hour shifts, maintaining production while carrying out routine inspections and scheduled maintenance. One of those maintenance tasks involved condensate pump. The pump had been removed from service so that its pressure safety valve could be taken away for inspection. While the valve was absent, engineers sealed the open pipe with a temporary metal blind flange. The arrangement was never intended for operation. It was simply a temporary measure until the safety valve could be reinstalled. The work was recorded through Piper Alpha's permit-to-work system, designed to ensure that equipment under maintenance could not accidentally be returned to service before work had been completed. Throughout the day, the maintenance continued as expected. Nothing suggested that the platform was only hours away from disaster. As evening approached, the day shift handed responsibility to the incoming night shift. Like every offshore installation, safe operation depended upon accurate communication between crews. The permit relating to condensate pump A indicated that the pump was not ready to be restarted. However, the associated pressure safety valve had not yet been refitted, and only the temporary blind flange remained in place. Later that evening, condensate pump B, the platform's operating pump, unexpectedly tripped. Production immediately became a concern. Restarting pump B proved unsuccessful, leaving the control room with a difficult decision. Operators knew another condensate pump was available, but the information showing that pump A was incomplete was either unavailable or not fully understood during the handover process. Believing the standby pump could safely return to service, the decision was made to restart condensate pump A. Within seconds, condensate under high pressure escaped through the temporary flange. A flammable vapor cloud rapidly formed around the equipment. Moments later, it found an ignition source. The escaping condensate mixed with air and formed a rapidly expanding cloud of highly flammable vapor. At approximately 9:55 p.m., it ignited. The first explosion tore through the production module, destroying equipment and rupturing nearby pipework. The blast immediately disrupted electrical systems and communications, while damaging the control room that coordinated the platform's emergency response. Automatic fire protection was never able to contain an event of this scale. Within moments, flames spread through processing equipment carrying oil and gas under pressure. Workers across the platform found themselves in rapidly changing conditions. Some attempted to fight the fire where they could. Others followed emergency procedures and moved towards the accommodation block, expecting further instructions from the control room. But many of the systems that coordinated those procedures had already been disabled. As the fire intensified, those waiting inside the accommodation block became increasingly isolated. Smoke-filled corridors, visibility deteriorated, and reliable information became almost impossible to obtain. Outside, the heat prevented many workers from reaching lifeboats or designated escape routes. The normal evacuation plan had begun to break down within minutes of the first explosion. The initial blast had been devastating, but it was only the beginning. As critical pipework failed, flames spread into the major gas pipelines connected to Piper Alpha. These lines contained enormous quantities of natural gas under extremely high pressure. One after another, the pipelines ruptured. Each rupture released fresh fuel into the fire, creating explosions far larger than the first. Massive fireballs engulfed sections of the platform, destroying steel supports and overwhelming every remaining firefighting capability. The disaster had now grown beyond the platform itself. Piper Alpha was being consumed by the very network that had made it one of the North Sea's most productive installations. The ruptured gas pipelines transformed the fire into an uncontrollable inferno. Each new explosion stripped away more of Piper Alpha's structure. Steel weakened under extreme temperatures, production modules collapsed, and burning debris fell into the sea below. Dense black smoke rose thousands of feet into the night sky, visible to crews on neighboring platforms and to vessels racing towards the scene. The platform's fixed firefighting systems were no longer capable of controlling the blaze. Critical equipment had been destroyed, communications had failed, and much of the installation was now inaccessible. Many of the men still alive faced impossible decisions. Some searched for routes through smoke and flames. Others climbed to the highest remaining parts of the platform, hoping rescue helicopters could reach them before the structure failed. For several, there was only one remaining escape. One after another, men leapt from heights of more than 100 feet into the cold North Sea below. Some survived the impact and were pulled aboard rescue vessels. Others were overcome by injuries, fire, or the freezing water before help could reach them. Rescue ships maneuvered as close as conditions allowed, while helicopter crews searched through smoke illuminated by towering flames. The danger was immense. Falling debris, intense heat, and repeated explosions forced rescuers to balance speed with their own survival. The fast rescue vessel Sandhaven was itself engulfed by fire during the operation, claiming the lives of crew members who had attempted to save others. By the time the fires were finally brought under control, Piper Alpha had been almost completely destroyed. Of the 226 men on board that night, 61 survived. 167 lost their lives. It remains the deadliest offshore oil disaster in history. In the days that followed, the scale of the disaster became painfully clear. Families gathered in Aberdeen and across the United Kingdom, waiting for confirmation that often arrived far too late. Recovery teams worked in dangerous conditions to search the wreckage and identify those who had been lost. The tragedy extended far beyond the platform itself. Entire communities had supplied workers to the offshore industry, and almost every family connected to North Sea oil knew someone affected by the disaster. Survivors carried physical injuries, while many others lived for years with the psychological impact of what they had witnessed that night. As the immediate emergency ended, attention turned to a far more difficult question. How had so many layers of protection failed on one of the world's most productive offshore platforms? The British government established a public inquiry led by Lord Cullen to determine exactly what had happened and how such a catastrophe could be prevented from happening again. Over many months, investigators examined engineering records, maintenance procedures, permit documentation, operating practices, and testimony from survivors and industry experts. The inquiry concluded that Piper Alpha was not destroyed by a single mistake. Instead, multiple technical, organizational, and procedural failures combined until a routine maintenance activity developed into an uncontrollable disaster. Communication between shifts had broken down. The permit-to-work system had failed to prevent unsafe equipment from being restarted. Emergency systems proved unable to cope with the scale of the incident, while the platform's layout and the continued flow of gas through connected pipelines dramatically intensified the fire. In 1990, Lord Cullen's report made 106 recommendations covering offshore safety, management, maintenance, emergency planning, and regulation. Those recommendations would fundamentally change the way offshore oil and gas installations were designed, operated, and supervised for decades to come. The legacy of Piper Alpha extends far beyond the remains of a platform that no longer exists. Following Lord Cullen's inquiry, the United Kingdom fundamentally changed the way offshore oil and gas safety was regulated. Responsibility for offshore safety moved away from the Department of Energy, and operators were required to demonstrate, through a formal safety case, that major hazards had been identified, assessed, and reduced to a level that was as low as reasonably practicable. Emergency planning became more rigorous. Fire and explosion protection received far greater attention during platform design, while permit-to-work systems, maintenance controls, training, and emergency exercises were strengthened throughout the offshore industry. No collection of regulations can eliminate every risk associated with producing oil and gas beneath the sea. Offshore work remains demanding, remote, and potentially dangerous, but many of the safety standards now regarded as essential were shaped by the lessons learned from Piper Alpha. Today, memorials in Aberdeen and across Scotland continue to honor the 167 men who never returned home on the night of the 6th of July, 1988. Their deaths transformed an industry. Their legacy continues to protect the lives of those who work offshore. Piper Alpha is remembered not only as one of the greatest industrial disasters in British history, but also as a lasting reminder that safety depends upon communication, preparation, and the willingness to learn from failure before tragedy is repeated.